Public CEO Report is a podcast that provides insights about the public sector and public policy for the benefit of decision makers and leaders powering our communities. I'm your host, Ryder Todd Smith, and today we're joined by Lindsey P. Horvath, Mayor of the City of West Hollywood and 2020-21 President of the California Contract Cities Association. I should also add, you are a candidate for LA County 3rd Supervisorial District seat. Lindsey, welcome to the Public CEO Report.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, so let's start with the basics, right? You clearly have public service running through your veins, having risen up through the ranks of council and West Hollywood, and now choosing to run for a county seat, which is in the largest county in the nation. Why'd you run for office in the first place?
You know, for me, it's about social justice. I was raised as a social justice Catholic, and I like to think I got the best parts of the church. And giving back and being of service is what we're called to do, I believe, to help one another, and especially when we're in times of need, to be there in community. And so when I moved to California, I tried to find ways to get involved in my community, to become invested and know more about the neighborhood in which I was living. And I met really incredible people. And when I talk to people who are transplants to the Los Angeles area, we always kind of have that in common, that once you find your people in this community, it just makes Los Angeles such a beautiful, amazing place to be a part of. And so for me, it's really about the people.
Where did you, just for our background, where'd you move from when you transplanted into LA?
Sure. I'm originally from the Midwest, from the east side of Cleveland, Ohio. My family moved to Las Vegas when I was in high school, so I lived there for a little while, went back to the Midwest for college. I attended the University of Notre Dame, and after graduating, I came out to California.
All right. And just for further context and rounding you out, when you are being the council member in West Hollywood is not a full-time job, as far as I recall. Is that a correct statement?
It's not considered a full-time job, but it certainly can be with all the things we're expected to do.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I don't suspect it pays like a full-time job, though. So you must somehow sustain yourself. What else do you do professionally outside of the world of politics?
I'm really lucky to work with an amazing creative team. I work in creative advertising for movies, television, and streaming services. And so it's something that I didn't expect to be doing when I moved out here, but through mutual friends, I was connected to a creative director and got into the industry and made a lot of friends and contacts. And I'm just really lucky to be able to be in such a fun industry.
Well, I suppose it only seems apropos, given that you're the mayor of West Hollywood, that you would be involved in Hollywood itself. So,
well, I guess there is that connection, though I often say that, I work with folks who are not always the most understanding in terms of timing and patience and all of those things. My job is to keep things on time and on budget, to make sure people are happy and getting what they need. So there are a lot of skills in there that translated to being of service to a community that's very engaged, and really wants to make sure that West Hollywood is the best community. So they reach out and engage a lot. And I think my work in creative advertising, surprisingly, actually gave me very good training for that.
Excellent. So what do you love about West Hollywood, right? I mean, you obviously are a resident there. You've been there for a while now, I would surmise. What is it about West Hollywood that's special?
I mean, what's not to love? It is 1.9 square miles of the most fun you'll ever have in your life. And we are lucky to have the iconic Sunset Strip. We have Santa Monica Boulevard. We have the Melrose and Beverly Design District. We have our Rainbow District. I mean, there's so much happening. People come to West Hollywood from all over the world to share in our history, to share in our culture, to make amazing memories. And we love being that place for people. But we're also a very small town. We are only 1.9 square miles. We're about 36,000 people, though. So it's a lot of people in a small small space, which means we get to know each other pretty quickly. A lot of us are renters, about close to 80%. And so a lot of us live in multifamily housing. So learning how to live with each other in close quarters is an art, I think. And but it also makes for a great opportunity to build community. And I think there's just so much to love about what happens here every day.
Yeah, I've often observed that the tighter your quarters are, the more kind of governance that you need to intervene to kind of facilitate the interaction of people in those environments, right? So I think that's partly why you tend to see more government engagement and involvement in higher density communities and cities and things like that. It's just kind of necessitated by being on top of each other, literally living on top of one another. That comes with high density housing. What do you think is? Go ahead.
That there are some people who don't really engage with their neighbors. In fact, some people will, call City Hall, saying my neighbor leaves their trash can out. Okay, well, did you talk to your neighbor? Did you give them a call? And so it's funny how living in close quarters, there are still some people who don't really engage. So I really try to encourage people to talk to each other, and I've kind of tried to be that person in my own buildings when I've lived in the city.
Yeah. Well, so we'll add Peacemaker to your roster of roles and successes.
Very good.
So what do you think is working well in local government? And I asked that question partly because you chose when you wanted to be of service, you chose the government as the role to do that, as opposed to say working through a church or some nonprofit group or something like that. So why government? What's working well in local government in California?
Well, I think everyone has the opportunity to be touched by government in their lives. And local government is really where we meet people most frequently every day, and people can see how they're being served or not being served, and engage very easily. I mean, I think we don't often think about, if you're just an average person, not somebody who's engaged in local government work or government work in general, but, people walking down sidewalks, driving down roads, seeing traffic lights, those are all things that we provide through government and people need. And, a lot of, hopefully, if we're doing it right, there are things that people can take for granted. They're not interfering with their life. They're helping enhance their quality of life. They're helping them get to jobs. They're helping them get to the places they want to go to have fun. They're the resources that we provide in the community, hopefully, are helping them take care of their families, their children, older adults. There's so much that government can provide to improve quality of life. And unlike some of the organizations that you mentioned, it touches everyone in a community. So you have the opportunity to truly make a difference for the greatest amount of people and do the greatest amount of good if you're serving right. And so I'm very grateful to be serving at the local level, to be able to deliver services and support to people who really need it, to be in a community who gets that and invests in that. We're a city that has spent at least 10% of our budget in most years on social services, whereas most cities rely on the county or other sources to provide that support. We fund it as a city. We've been a progressive city where we've, most people don't always align progressive values with fiscal responsibility, but that's what we do in West Hollywood. And, we had a reserve that during this time of economic hardship and just a lot of challenges that we faced during COVID-19, we were able to continue to care for people and provide them services and support that they needed. And so, it feels really good to be able to do that and to be that support for people. Certainly, there are things we don't get right, and that's tough. But I think we're better when more and different voices are engaged in the public conversation, and so that's what we strive to do.
So I guess let me talk about one area in there too, about in terms of like what's working well. West Hollywood, from my perspective, working in the local government space, has a reputation for being particularly well funded, having really solid revenue sources. I would assume that some combination of strong TOT revenues from hotel stays, high income. It's a high income community in general. I think it's relatively high income compared to a lot of the LA area, combined with the fact that you have a very good restaurant scene and the Sunset Strip. So you have a lot of sales tax generating businesses in the area that attract outside money into the area. So first of all, is that an accurate description that it's a relatively well-funded city compared to others that give you that capacity to do more, so to speak?
We are lucky to have a lot of sources of revenue. You're right. TOT is our number one source of revenue. So we always encourage people to come visit West Hollywood. We do have people, though, people might not always think of that first when you think of West Hollywood, but we do have people who are struggling financially. There are people that we're trying to help lift out of poverty. And that's why we've adopted progressive policies like our rent stabilization ordinance, inclusionary housing policies, and again, funding for social services to help support and provide that safety net for people living in the city who are struggling.
Yeah. How about, so you, I guess one other question, then I'll just throw another one in there too. Okay. So the question here is generally focused around what's working well. Is there any other particular kind of West Hollywood program? You just went through a good laundry list of some progressive policies and whatnot, but any other particular program that you think is just totally awesome that you're really proud of in West Hollywood? Maybe something you've championed that you think is really interesting, or something that is such a good policy that you think other cities should consider adopting it, even if they aren't perhaps as progressive as West Hollywood or having the same kind of density and infrastructure as West Hollywood?
Sure. I mean, there are so many to name. I think one that comes to mind that actually, after I initiated it in the city, then Attorney General Kamala Harris implemented in her office was a transition guidelines for the workplace. And it helps a workplace accommodate someone who may be gender transitioning during their time of employment. And I raised that to your question. I understand not every city has the political views that are often expressed in our community or takes the position that we do. But I think it's important to mention for that reason. We're the kind of city that would pioneer something like that, but we created a policy that then our Chamber of Commerce adopted and is now a policy that got adopted in the state of California, and I think will become increasingly the trend to just help workplace environments accommodate everyone who brings their talents to benefit that business to work in a safe and accommodating work environment. But we also, and of course, we're known for our LGBTQ community. We have over 40% of our city identifying as LGBTQ. So, it makes sense that we would pioneer in policies like that. But, we're forging ahead in our relationship with Metro, working to bring Crenshaw Northern Extension of Metro Rail to the city, which will not only serve our city, but the entire region, providing jobs, access to arts and culture destinations, connecting our area to the airport, to the Hollywood Bowl. I mean, it's a really exciting, huge project that our city has undertaken, and grateful to have the partnership with Metro that we do in bringing that forward. But there are policies of all kinds. In the face of COVID-19, we worked with our business community to create out zones and get businesses back up and running, which is important not only to have those businesses have a way to operate, but also to have people be able to continue working in their jobs, have a source of income. And so we worked very collaboratively with the business community. And I thought that was particularly important. And, shout out, of course, to our amazing staff at City Hall who made that happen. I think all of us transitioned in what felt like a blink of an eye to working with instead of being all together at City Hall. And so finding ways to deliver those services, I think has been absolutely extraordinary. And for all the cities that have had to do that, kudos to you for the ways that you've stepped up and tried to deliver in this really difficult time.
And just to clarify, you use the term out zone. Is that a outdoor dining arrangement that you guys did, or what is an out zone? I don't want to presume.
Yeah, so it was outdoor dining, but other businesses also used it, whether it was waiving encroachment permit fees and, allowing people to operate on the sidewalks, getting people out into, open air areas, of course, because of the public health order, but just being able to expand their operations so it was safer for people to, participate in retail, whatever the businesses were. We worked with some of our creative arts businesses to find ways that they could, like at the Whiskey, still have live performances that they could stream and have their audiences meet them online, get some of that, music vibe that everybody loves to come to West Hollywood for, right in your own home. Certainly everyone wants to go back to the Whiskey, myself included, but in the interim, we had to find a safe way for people to be able to have that experience. And so, I'm just grateful that we have so many community partners that want to work with us, to help us find creative solutions, to come to the table and work collaboratively.
Yeah. All right. So we took some time there to talk about things that are working well in local government and why you're enthusiastic about it, and clearly enthusiastic enough that you want to elevate to the Board of Supervisors to continue doing that work on a broader scale. But sometimes things don't work well in local government too. So what's broken in local government in California from your perspective?
Well, I think there's a disconnect between how people first think to interact with each other, to solve problems in a 21st century world. And our government systems have not quite caught up to that. I think, having in-person meetings be the only way that people can access their government, especially if they're held during the week, during the daytime, it just doesn't make sense for how most people will be able to access their government. Having to take time off work is just not an option for many people. And often those are the people who need the help the most. So, finding ways that we can meet people where they are, directly engage, use technology to get people more active and participating in our democracy, I think we just haven't gotten there yet. And, even the ways that meetings are structured, it doesn't make sense often. You have to train people to understand if you're going to come and speak in public comment for 2 minutes on something that isn't on the agenda, the council's not going to respond to you, even if you think it's the most urgent, pressing need in the community right in that moment. And so, just how we do government is rooted in a bygone era. And, I'm grateful that we have the democracy that we do, but it only is a good one if we're able to actually empower people to engage with it and to use it to their benefit. And so, I think we have some work to do in that regard.
My firm, Tripepi Smith, does work all over California, working for cities, helping them with their communications. But one of the kind of revelations I've had in my head as I've thought about this over the last couple of years is that I think a failure to properly teach civics and basic high school education has created a pretty extended generation, if not multi-generation reality of folks who just don't understand government or understand the basics of how it works. And so oftentimes I feel like the job we're doing at the firm to help cities communicate is really a civics 101 that people should have gotten when they were 16, 17 years old in high school and didn't. And I don't want to, I'm not saying that because I think people are just dumb. It's just that they haven't had an opportunity to get into the nuance of it. And to be blunt, I think you and I would both appreciate that it's not exactly like government's simple. I mean, you take a place like LA County, you got multiple layers of government, special districts overlaying those. You got a vector control district over here, and then you got a municipal water district over here, and you got a wholesale water district on top of that. Then you got, the list goes on and on. So it's a complex environment, but more than ever, it seems to me that we are at the same time facing a reality that a big chunk of our population just hasn't had the need or the opportunity to kind of learn about some of those basics of how the government is structured, to know these are the three branches of government, and this is the feds and the state and the role of the county and the role of the city, and on the list goes.
Yeah, when I first got onto the city council, I was in my mid-20s, and I was serving at the time in National Women's Political Caucus leadership, and I very vividly remember after I got onto the council, someone in our caucus, she was probably in her mid-50s at the time, reached out to me and said, I've thought about running for office, but could you tell me what a city council member does? And I just, based on the education that I was afforded in my life and, how I engaged with cities, growing up, when I lived in Las Vegas, our family helped elect Oscar Goodman as Las Vegas mayor, and then his wife after him, and actually she was my high school guidance counselor in Las Vegas. So, I was very close to local government sort of at every stage of my life. And so to find myself in this position, being involved in politics, having sort of that experience and having that question was unexpected to me. And so
Right.
place trying to explain how local government works for folks, and so it was really interesting to be in that space. So I agree, there are a lot of people who don't quite know how things have worked, but I will say there has been a recent trend, especially of millennials and younger, really getting to understand what local government does and figuring out how to harness their power at the local level. And it's really interesting to see how that's changing, who's leading the decisions, who's participating in conversations, and which direction those conversations will go as a result of who's participating in them. For so long, campaigns really targeted an older demographic because they were the most reliable voters. But now, things are changing. I think digital engagement is really playing a big role in that shift.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would also just say, like, things like the pandemic, as I like to point out, the pandemic has introduced more people to more government than they ever thought was really possible, right? The mere act of asking people to quarantine at home for 14 days, for example, or things along those lines are just kind of, 2 years ago, if you talked about that, people would have said you're crazy.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the consequences of engaging your public with the hand of government, right or wrong, one could argue about that on a separate podcast. But regardless, is you get a public who experiences government in a big way, and now all of a sudden the reaction to that is, well, that's going to impact my life. I better engage in this bad boy, right? So I think there's a natural human response to say, okay, this is clearly becoming a bigger part of my life, having an impact on my life. I'm going to counter and become more engaged in it to better understand what it is that's affecting me on a day-to-day basis, partly because it's become more relevant than ever.
Absolutely. And, people know now what the public health department could be responsible for in a time of crisis. And then they, started to learn how they engage with their favorite local restaurants. So, there are just so many ways that people were introduced to services, support that are offered on a daily basis, and then how government can step up, or they developed ideas how government ought to be stepping up when people really need help the most. And so I suspect that the experience that we've had this year and change isn't just going to be limited to, what we see now isn't just going to be limited to getting businesses back up and running, or, getting people back to work. I think it's really going to, become a conversation of how do we continue fixing what has been broken even before COVID-19, and making sure that we have the best systems in place to support folks. I think, seeing how people struggled with EDD during this time, for example, it's existed for a very long time. And for a very long time, there were people that were not well served by it. But it took a pandemic to, make people realize just how much needs to be invested into that program to get it to work functionally. And so, I think it's opened a lot of people's eyes on the outside to what they want to see change in their government. And I think it's opened a lot of people's eyes on the inside as to, the things that we just kind of took for granted that need to be shaken up and done better.
Yeah. Yeah, the EDD one is kind of an interesting case. First of all, because there's been so much money spent already trying to fix the EDD long before the pandemic. So it's understandable that from some perspectives, the answer is not throw more money at it, because there's been no building of confidence that it's worked in the first place. And then on top of that, I mean, we're talking about several tens of $billion scandal that's now happened with false claims around the EDD and other money that just kind of disappeared that turns into a real boondoggle. I mean, that's a tough nut, to kind of address or think about when you think about the complexities of that particular situation. From my perspective, it just seems like it's both an indicator, perhaps a bright red line indicator saying, hey, there's a real problem here. We got to fix this thing and make it work right. And on the other hand, it's also a bright line indicator saying, hey, we've been trying to fix this thing for a long time, and something is fundamentally broken in Sacramento that makes us unable to fix our EDD. And I'm not sure which one is going to ultimately weigh out in the interpretation of that. Although fundamentally, maybe the answer is, it doesn't matter. It's got to get fixed if you want the thing to work properly.
Right. And so you have to elect people who are actually interested in that job to do it well, while they're there. And I think, there's a lot of folks I've seen now who run for offices that it's not really the work they want to be doing, but, they were an elected official somewhere else, and now it's their turn to do this. And, so I think people are really checking into, how people are going to step up in the role that they're seeking to serve, and what it is they're looking to do. You can pass a lot of bills that either sound nice or do something nice for people, but if you're not really looking at those fundamentals to make sure that you're able to deliver services and support to people, especially when they need it most, and then you're relying on those systems to deliver to people, and that they're not working, it doesn't make sense. And that's why people just get really frustrated with government, over things that you expect to work. You just expect that if you call, 911, that somebody's going to answer and respond. And so if that's not happening, people are going to be disappointed no matter what the excuse or reason is. So,
yeah. Well, and when you start to, this will, could snowball into a much broader conversation too about kind of faith in institutions in America, but across the political spectrum, there's growing lack of faith, right? So we're losing faith in many of the institutions that have kind of been the bulwark of our society. EDD would be just a small example of those broader assumptions, whether you also have the institution of policing or the institution of tax structures or the justice system being, from differing perspectives, being fair or unfair. So it's a fundamental challenge when those kind of bedrocks of what we can all come to I would almost say, I guess, our social contract of agreement, when even those things we disagree on, it's a real challenge for us to try to face.
Right. And I think that's why typically people have had a higher level of confidence in local government because they're closer to it. They can have a more direct influence over it. When I cast a vote at city council on a Monday evening, if I'm grocery shopping the next day, somebody's going to come and let me have it if I haven't listened to them or
Yep.
demonstrated that I've listened to them, in the way that we deliberate. And so, it's that quick and that close. And so, in that way, I find it rewarding because I like feedback and I like engaging with people and I like knowing where people are at. So I make sure that the service that I'm offering is of the moment and is checked into the things that people care about.
Yeah, 100%. Being closer to the people has a lot more direct responsibility. I would also say just city government in general is just on a smaller scale, so it's more manageable, so to speak, right? Like when your mistake is made, and they get made at the city level too, but when it's made, it's manageable, it's definable, it's not $30 billion mistake. And I also would suggest that the kind of theoretically, these are nonpartisan positions you hold in city council. You don't run as a Republican or Democrat or any particular party. You just run with ideas. Now, those ideas may hew to one party or the other, but regardless, when you're sitting on the dais, the mission is to deliver for the community and not engage in some kind of game and cards or Game of Thrones, battle royale, trying to outseat the other person and essentially to the inefficiency or to the detriment of the institution itself, right? Like at the end of the day, you want your city manager to have the tools that he or she needs to deliver for the community and help make the place better, because if it doesn't work, you're going to have to see those people, at the grocery store the next day, and that's going to be a real challenge.
Right. Exactly.
Let's turn real quick to Contract City Association. It's another big part of your world, something that you've been involved with now for several years. What is California Contract Cities Association?
California Contract Cities Association is a collection of local governments. It's a membership association of local governments. I think we're over 70 cities now. And we came together originally as an organization to provide support for cities who were contracting for sheriff and fire services in LA County. And the association, since that time, has expanded to include cities who contract for service for any number of issues, public works, you name it. And it could be from LA County, it could be from a private provider. And, of course, most cities contract for some sort of service. And so what we do is engage cities in educational opportunities, advocacy opportunities, especially at the county and state level, and networking opportunities to learn best practices from cities throughout the region, and to allow people access to the government that they're looking to access, whether it's local government officials trying to access county and state, whether it's our partners who are in the private sector who are providing services that they think could help enhance the work and services that local governments provide to their communities, and sort of everything in between. And I have found it to be a truly rewarding experience to engage with cities, some of whom are like mine, some of whom are not. Just to learn from how their cities have worked. We're a relatively young city, incorporated in 1984. So some ways we've done things that have worked very well for our community, but we can always learn from folks around us, and we can also share what we've done, and hopefully for the benefit of others. But it's a really eclectic collection of cities too, I think, and unlike any organization I've gotten involved with in local government, which sometimes can be a little stodgy and a little stiff or very overly policy wonky, Contract Cities has been very warm, very family oriented, and really invited me and so many people in to benefit. That you get from Contract Cities what you give to it, and the more you give, in my case, the more I was able to get out of it for my own personal development, but more importantly, for the benefit of our city. And it's a really amazing association. So I encourage people to join.
So West Hollywood, you all contract with the LA County Sheriff's Department for your policing services, right? Public safety?
Yes, we do. And LA County Fire as well.
I was going to ask. So LA County Fire. So just for context for the average viewer out there, those are, I would assume, the two biggest contracts that you have on an annual basis in terms of your budget, total budget, right?
Yeah, they are. And it's interesting, though, because, many cities, if they have their own police department, could spend over 50% of their budget providing law enforcement or more traditional public safety services in their communities. Some communities spend quite a bit on their contracts, just to be able to provide those services for their communities. In our case, in West Hollywood, we spend about 20% of our budget on our law enforcement contract, and that's pretty low for cities. And yet we've been able to provide a really high quality level of service when it comes to public and community safety. I think we've partnered, law enforcement with community services, and kind of had that 360 approach to making sure people are safe and cared for in community. And so it's been really great. And gratefully, we and our local station in West Hollywood have had partners at our local station that are interested in that kind of approach. So it's but yes, they are a very important part of our budget and the work that we do in the city.
Well, and they seem to be, as you noted, kind of one of the founding elements of Contract Cities Association. And I think for the audience to understand, like contracting for those particular services in general, they're always a big part of the city budgets. West Hollywood is, as you noted, an anomaly a bit in how small a portion it is, although it's still probably your biggest contract, even if it's the smallest portion relative to other cities. But there are other cities that routinely have 30-40% of their general fund budget is being spent on a contract with LA County Sheriff to provide policing services, a space that is expensive to provide services in, and getting more expensive every year as liability costs rise and demands on policing rise, and other kind of demands are placed upon the sheriff's department in general. They turn around and provide those services back to the public agencies that they serve.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we just had our budget subcommittee meeting in West Hollywood, and we'll be, looking at our budget coming up in June, of course. And, we looked at the pie chart of the things that we ask law enforcement to do in our community, and not even 50% of it was crime suppression. And when you think of law enforcement, I think when the average person thinks of law enforcement, that's what they're thinking about. How do you stop crime from happening? And so when we're asking law enforcement to do all kinds of other stuff that in many cases they're not trained to do, it's not what they were first hired to do in your community, you're not necessarily setting them up to succeed. And so I think, everybody's having conversations around what that balance is, and how you provide community safety services. And I think, as local government officials, we really need to think critically about that. Who is the best deliverer of a service? And in the case of our city in relationship to the sheriff's department, how do we make sure the contract that we have and the way it's implemented in our city actually looks like what we're intending? And, because I think for most cities who contract for services, we're using a relatively base form contract upon which the service is then delivered. So, if a bunch of cities, if over 40 cities have the same base contract, you can imagine not all of those cities have the same issues, the same concerns.
Right.
So, working with your local station to bring that contract to life, so to speak, in the way that's best and most important for your community to be served, is important. Really thinking that through. And I think Contract Cities provides a space to talk about those real costs that you mentioned in terms of liability, talks about, gives us a space to talk about how do we, perhaps modify that base contract to reflect, the realities in 2021 as opposed to when it was originally created. And and also a place where we can talk about how do we think about even having that conversation in our city and making sure that we get the service that we signed up for. And so I think it's a really great place for us to have all those conversations, not only for an education perspective, but also to make a difference in how they're delivered. And, there's strength in numbers. And I think the association really delivers that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's super complex issue, super complex contract, complex liability questions in there. And to your point, having a bunch of peer agencies who are involved in that space give you that size to be able to think and move in a healthy and thoughtful way that you wouldn't otherwise get if you were just like one-off West Hollywood trying to do your thing, and then you got Walking Down Flint Ridge doing their thing. And there's still some independence, obviously, for each agency and what they want to contract for, but the underlying services are, I think, really part of the mix that make it helpful for contract cities to be sharing ideas and united in how they approach some of this stuff.
Absolutely. One of the things that they did too, when the contract was first created, cities didn't have a seat at the table in terms of any liability costs that were assigned to contract cities. And so it was through California Contract Cities Association that there then was an effort at the county level that then delivered what is now called the Claims Board and Oversight Committee. And those two bodies, hear the cases that are liability cases in the contract cities, and we actually get a say now in how those funds are dispersed, how decisions are made, and we have a sense of what some of the trends might be and how those cases are going. And there was a time where that wasn't even happening. When something happened in a city, the county just said you got to pay for it, and we didn't really have a way to look at those costs critically to make sure that they were appropriately and correctly assigned to cities. So now we have that, and that happened because of contract cities.
Yeah, it's a fair point, and I think one of the policy nuances here that's really interesting to explore, and I think frankly it'd be interesting to explore on a statewide basis, is these costs are referred to as liability costs, right? So they're the cost overhead that comes with, I have a deputy, they come to my city, they do work, but there's also this additional layer of liability costs that essentially does risk the cost for risk services around them, or if they're involved in a car accident or something bad happens on there while they're performing, the city in which they're doing that work is held liable or is on the hook for that. And so then this is where this board comes in that you're discussing. What struck me is there are some pretty big differences county by county on what that actual liability is. And so it's a significant cost. I mean, my gut tells me it's like 20 to 30% additional cost for policing services when you add that liability coverage on top of it, which is really just an astronomical number. It gets very expensive very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that was one of the priority issues in our term this last year in the association, was managing those liability costs and, how the contract, what the contract calls for. In our case, we were looking at a potentially significant increase at a time where cities were literally being told to shut down, businesses were shutting down. And so we were cut off from not just new revenue streams, but existing revenue streams. So just to have a cost increase at that time, logistically didn't make sense, not because we didn't want to pay our contracts, but we just have to figure out how to do it in the right way. And it was the association that really worked with the county and the department to broker an agreement on how those costs could be managed going forward. So all of those conversations are important in a good year, but especially in a challenging one, having that on your side is really important.
Yeah. And lastly, I'll just, at the risk of soapboxing it here, but I'm just ideating as you're talking. It's interesting to me because we hear a lot about mental health services now as a big area of policy focus in government service delivery. A lot of focus on the history of mental health services in California and where we've been and what was eliminated and kind of where the funding is these days. And that ties into crime, it ties into homelessness, it ties into a bunch of issues. It almost has me wondering, like, does the contract model for sheriff services and fire services perhaps pretend a model that would be applicable for mental health services too, where cities can be contracting with the county for, a very effective county mental health services department to bring those resources in and operate kind of like you can contract for the sheriff services. And maybe I'm out of my league. Maybe that's already happening extensively. I've seen little elements of it here and there, but I'm just curious if you have a perspective on that, or maybe that's already happening from your perspective.
Yeah, we definitely need more of those services. And yes, that is the purview of the county, and they should be providing those services to cities. And I think that needs to be built out and invested in much, much more. And to your point, when I first became mayor in 2015, I did several nights of ride-alongs with our sheriff's department in the late hours from 10 at night till 4 in the morning, because I wanted to see the nightlife the way they saw it. And, on one of those ride-alongs, a deputy happened to mention, our MET team. And I said, tell me about that. And so it's a mental evaluation team, which sends out a clinically trained social worker on a 5150 call to respond, to be that first point of response. And this person can diagnose someone on the spot, get them into a 72-hour medical hold instead of citing them or putting them in jail, and hopefully connect them with services and care that stabilizes them in the short term. But through that stabilization, possibly makes them open to housing, services, treatment, further treatment, a lot of things that are available. And I was like, why don't we, okay, so that sounds great. And they said, yeah, but the problem is we only have a couple for the entire county. So if we call the MET team from wherever they are in the county, it could take 4 hours for them to respond. Mm-hmm. That doesn't make sense. So our city decided, I led the effort in the city to pursue a contract with the county to have a dedicated MET team in our station. And when we finally completed that contract, the county also assigned a second MET team. So now we have 2 MET teams out of the West Hollywood station. One we pay for, and one which was complemented by the county to help serve not just West Hollywood, but the region. And, it's been a night and day difference in terms of, how we can respond to things and the level of service that's able to be provided. But I will tell you, it took us 2 years to get through the county bureaucracy, make that contract happen. And, for the privilege of giving the county, our city resources, to provide a service to our constituents that we think the county should be providing already. And so, there's some work to do there. But it's certainly something we're trying to model so that way other cities can do the same thing.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like it's probably a great area for contract cities to explore more extensively in case other members of contract cities want to pursue similar type services. If West Hollywood has blazed the trail on that, as it has blazed the trail in so many areas, it would be hopeful for the other organizations and contract cities to kind of see that unfold, and great use for the Contract Cities Association group. I want to start to put a bow on our conversation here, just to respect your time. But I do want to turn to an important announcement. So you recently announced that you're running for county supervisor. I believe so. It's in the 3rd supervisorial seat, correct?
Yes.
And that is currently held by Supervisor Kuehl, correct?
That's right.
All right. So I got all my facts straight. Why are you running for county supervisor? Why leave the great confines of West Hollywood and go forth into the broader LA County area?
I think my experience as a mayor during COVID really brought to light how important it is, not just for my city, but for the entire region to benefit from a well-functioning LA County. And in this moment where people are counting on the county to deliver services and support in a time that we really need it, you need somebody in there who's a fighter, who's going to roll up their sleeves and do the hard work. And, that's what I have done in my community. And that's what I intend to do in LA County, not only for my city, but for the region and for the whole county too. And, when you look at the number one issue, when you talk to people who are running for office, or you just talk to people in community, the number one concern in most places is homelessness. And it is, it has reached epidemic proportions. It was a crisis before COVID. And now as we're thinking about, the end of that emergency order and people figuring out how they're going to deal with their back pay on their house or their rent for their apartment, we're looking at potentially even more homelessness. So, we have to have somebody who's going to come in and actually make an impact on that issue. The county has close to a $30 billion annual budget. More has to be done on homelessness. And, in West Hollywood, our approach is multifaceted and, really literally meets people where they are on the street and bring services, support, care, whatever it is they need. And we have found in just recent years that we were able to get, in some cases, 80% of those identified as homeless off the street and into housing services or both. And then the next year see a 30% increase on the previous year's number just because of, what's going on in the region. So we have a model that's working. Certainly not everything that happens in West Hollywood is going to work everywhere, but I do have a strategy to approach how we serve people experiencing homelessness differently. And on day one, we can get to work on that. I think we need to create a regional transportation network that serves people, not just, the shortest route or the most direct point from A to B, but really where people want to go. And we have experience doing that with the Crenshaw Northern Extension, but I want to bring that experience to bear for a regional transportation network that actually serves the needs of the region. And of course, as we're looking at COVID recovery, our businesses have been struggling. We need to get them back up and running, not just to get those revenue streams in that, communities are counting on, and not just to get them back up and running for their own businesses, but obviously so we get people back into jobs that provide them the livelihood that they're counting on to have a good quality of life here in LA County. And so we can't just get people back to any old job. They need to be good jobs that they can take care of their families. And we know that the circumstances that existed before COVID-19 weren't great for everybody. So, we're not just fixing what happened this past year. We're trying to fix a broken system. And, it's a big job, but one I'm excited to do. And I think the conversations that are happening at the county around what community safety looks like, how we address these very large problems, it's work that I'm doing in West Hollywood. It's work I'm, excited about, work that I feel called to do. And this is the job that I want. So I'm excited about it. It's not, I know that for other folks, it might be, something that they're looking to do if they have, this kind of resume or this kind of life experience. But for me, it's the work that drives me.
Right. Right. So where do, so what I heard there was in some taking on homelessness, economic development, and mass transit were kind of big threes that you're trying to take on. Is that a fair statement?
I think that's true. Certainly, there are a number of issues that the county tackles. When you have over 100,000 employees and a $30 billion budget, there's a lot going on there. But I think those topics are ones that I find most people are talking about and are top of mind in short order. Obviously, in addition to community safety.
Well, Mayor Horvath, if you can solve any one of those, bravo. Bravo, mission accomplished.
Yeah, you know what?
They're all big ones.
I'll get on it.
Well, but somebody's got to try, right? You got to try. They're worthwhile pursuits to get fixed and get right. So, and where can people learn more about your campaign?
LindseyHorvath.com, LindseyHorvath.com.
All right, and we will post that URL. I will ask my engineer in the background to magically make that appear on the screen as well to make it easy for people to find, and we'll link it in the YouTube video for this podcast as well. I want to thank. I'm sorry.
Serving California Contract Cities Association and helping us stay connected and getting our message out there. And so, for folks who are following your work, I just want to say from firsthand experience that, our association benefited from your work. I know many communities in our association work with you directly, and they've benefited from your work. So I'm glad to know that people are listening to you and hopefully are checking into how they can partner with you in the work that they're doing, because you really deliver.
Well, thank you. Very kind of you to say that. I appreciate it. We've had a great experience in the 12 years that we've been really focused on local government world. Contract Cities was kind of one of my first pit stops to be involved with. And I've grew up in that organization, so to speak, in local government. And just as you described it, as a warm, family-oriented environment, very friendly, that's been my experience through and through with everybody I've had the opportunity to work with, all the presidents, certainly including yourself as president of Contract Cities. So I appreciate your commitment to service and your work product and effort that you've done in West Hollywood, and excited to see that you're running for county supervisor, and look forward to seeing you out there in the campaign, making it happen. It's exciting times for you.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited about it, and I'll definitely see you out there.
And that's today's report. My thanks to Lindsey for joining us, and from the whole PublicCEO team and myself, Ryder Todd Smith, thank you for your time. We hope you learned something new and inspiring that'll help you in your public service. Remember, PublicCEO has a daily newsletter that is free to those who sign up at PublicCEO.com. If you have feedback, questions, or guest suggestions for PublicCEO Report, please email alex@PublicCEO.com.